Hello everyone, welcome to the Yissilmissil Productions channel. My name is Yissilmissil, and today we are doing part 10 of our deep dive series into the Chicago film industry. And we are on chapter 10 today. So I hope you all are doing well. We will be starting shortly. Today is chapter 10. Essanay signs Charlie Chaplin. So I have a few new photos in the slideshow, but we'll be showing more of the Essanay again. But I hope you're all doing well, and we will get started here. All right. So chapter 10. Essanay signs Charlie Chaplin. In 1914, the Essanay Film Manufacturing Company was poised to become the most powerful movie studio in the world. Despite being financially strapped at the end of the previous calendar year, it still had its employ many of the top draws in America's nascent film industry. A series of high-quality popular movies on the cutting edge of the new medium might have saved the studio. George Spohr, however, had lost the power that had brought him this far in the first place, his ability to see the future. Unlike his crosstown rival William Selig, Spohr believed that short films would continue to dominate the movies. Spohr had also stopped caring much about the quality. By now, he cared mostly about product. Essanay star Gloria Swanson thought that the movies in which she acted were so stupid that she allegedly never even agreed to spend the 20-odd minutes it would have taken to see one of them in its entirety. Essanay seemed to have recognized some sort of star quality in Swanson, although they never used her as anything but an extra. She noted in her autobiography that although some girls fretted over their parts, she did not. Quote, "I couldn't tell the good parts from the bad ones," end quote, she wrote. Quote, "Every picture started out new and different and ended up just like the last one," end quote. She did not like working at Essanay much at all, and often wished she had listened to people who told her to stay away from the movies on the ground that they were, quote, vulgar, end quote. Certainly there were some vulgar goings-on. She could hear Francis X. Bushman and Beverly Bain carrying on an affair in the latter's dressing room. Ooh. At one point, in a wordless exchange towards the end of her tenure, Bushman put a hand on Swanson's knee, and she responded by slapping him in the face. In 1914, Essanay made a bold move that could have ensured both its ongoing success and Chicago's place as the film capital of the world. It signed Charles Chaplin, the man who would soon become the most popular single actor in motion picture history, to start working for Essanay for its 1915 season. You can see on the slideshow here, this is one of the posters, as well as this one here. As it had done when it turned down the $45 a week salary demand of Mary Pickford, the studio blew the Chaplin connection, and 1915 would be the year the company began to fall apart. The British-born Chaplin had first been to Chicago in 1910 on his initial trip to America with the Carno Company, spelled K-A-R-N-O, a vaudeville troupe with which he was best known for playing a funny elderly drunk in sketches, though he himself was only 20 years old at the time. That year, the Carno troupe had played an engagement at the American Music Hall at 8th Street and Wabash Avenue during a cold stint in February, and Chaplin had found the city to be stimulating, if not necessarily pretty. Chicago was, he later wrote, quote, attractive in its ugliness, grim and begrimed, a city that still had the spirit of the frontier days, a thriving, heroic metropolis. The vast plains approaching it are, I imagine, similar to the Russian steppes. It had a fierce pioneer gaiety that enlivened the senses, yet underlying it throbbed masculine loneliness. End quote. Chaplin was back in town with Carno in 1911 and 1912, but the life of a traveling vaudeville player was hardly glamorous, even though the $75 per week he earned was good money at the time. The hotel on Wabash Avenue, where the troupe stayed, was a seedy joint where quarters were shared with burlesque dancers. L trains clattered constantly past the window, and Chaplin later recalled, quote, flickered on my bedroom wall like an old-fashioned bioscope. End quote. It's a pretty good description. He also noted, perhaps with a hint of regret, that nothing ever happened between him and the dancers. Of course, if he were seeking such an encounter, he would not have had to look far. Chicago at the time was still well known for its red light districts, with which most vaudevillains, certainly including the Carno Company, were well acquainted. In smaller towns, the Carno Company would sometimes even rent out entire bordellos for the night. Had they walked a mere block west from the American Music Hall to State Street, they would have been right in the middle of an area known as Satan's Mile, which extended from Whiskey Row a few blocks north to the Levee District 4 blocks south. There, a man of means could attend the Everly Club, which offered its own orchestras, a library which one patron famously said was educating the wrong end of the girls. That's a really good statement. And a client list that included royalty. A man who could not afford such luxury could walk another block and find himself at places with names like Bedbug Row and the Bucket of Blood, with several middle-class options in between. In his autobiography, Chaplin particularly remembered a place called the House of All Nations, though he avoided saying that he had actually been there. In all likelihood, he probably had not. The brothel he described was actually not the House of All Nations, but the Everly Club, where the $50 per night minimum was far beyond his means at the time. The actual House of All Nations was a somewhat seedier joint with 2 entrances, one for $2 girls and one for $5 girls, with the dim lighting scheme preventing patrons from realizing that the same girls were behind both doors. The child of English music hall performers, Chaplin had spent much of his childhood in poverty. His father had been a performer in the days when performers were expected to drink with patrons after every show, and his alcoholism killed him at the age of 37, when Charles was only 12 years old. His mother lost her voice, killing her theatrical career, and then lost her mind. She was sent to an insane asylum, and the young Charles was sent to, not sure how to say this, Dickensian Workhouse. And it's spelled Dickensian. Having dealt with hunger and uncertainty, he never became complacent in success. Quote, "The saddest thing I can imagine," he wrote, "is to get used to luxury." End quote. Comedy was a means to an end for Chaplin, the best way he knew to keep his rent paid and his stomach full. During his first tour of America with Carno, he and his fellow performer, a trapeze artist, very nearly gave up showbiz to buy 1,000 acres of land in Arkansas on which to start a hog farm. Cinema might have lost the performer and director that would come to be known as the first true genius of silent comedy had he not picked up a book on the science of hog farming and been horrified to learn that as a farmer, he would have to castrate hogs. Given a choice between continuing to play a drunk on stage for an uncertain paycheck and gambling on a more respectable future that involved cutting off pig testicles, he stuck with the stage. It did not take long for film companies to notice Chaplin's talent on the vaudeville stage. Around the time Carno played Chicago for a third time in the fall of 1912, he caught the eye of two companies, Essanay and Los Angeles-based Keystone. Gilbert Anderson sought out Chaplin to offer him a contract with Essanay. With films still widely regarded as a novelty and the engagement with Carno steady, Chaplin was hesitant. Anderson was unable to work out with Spohr the exact details of the contract, and while Anderson and Spohr delayed, Chaplin signed with first with Mack Sennett, Sennett, of Keystone, and headed to L.A. The delay was the first of many mistakes Essanay would make with regard to Chaplin over the next few years. Of course, no one knew at the time that the funny young comedian who played a drunk in a vaudeville show would turn out to be a genius, and Chaplin himself was not optimistic about the whole business of motion pictures. He had seen a handful of Keystone comedies and did not think much about their rough and tumble style, which generally featured as many cops as possible falling over one another in scenarios that invariably ended with a chase. Chaplin knew, however, what a great vehicle for publicity the movies could be. If he could survive a stint at Keystone, he could soon return to vaudeville as a major star. And Sennett was offering $150 per week, twice what he made with Carno. At the Keystone studio, 3 pictures were generally made side by side. The awestruck Chaplin likened it to something one would have seen at the World's Fair. There was seldom anything like a script. Sennett would simply get an idea and a location and then let things develop into a chase scene. Chaplin had been engaged, he felt, to fill the shoes of Ford Sterling, a popular star of the day, who was leaving to join Universal Pictures. Many, Chaplin included, felt that Sennett may have made a mistake. Screenwriter Elmer Ellsworth, in particular, was openly skeptical. Quote, "Well, end quote. Ellsworth said to Chaplin, quote, "You'd better be funny," end quote. Quote, "If I'm half as funny as you look," end quote, Charlie quipped. Quote, "I'll do it right," end quote. Ellsworth bought him a drink. Instead of simply imitating Sterling, Chaplin, in need of a different costume, created the now familiar character of the Little Tramp, the wandering romantic with mustache, in baggy pants, a tiny jacket, and bowler hat. As soon as he put on the costume for the first time, Chaplin immediately understood the character completely and ran to Senate to introduce him to what would be his new star. Quote, "You know," end quote, he told Senate, quote, "this fellow is many-sided. A tramp, a gentleman, a poet, a dreamer, a lonely fellow, always hopeful of romance and adventure. He would have you believe he is a scientist, a musician, a duke, a polo player. However, he is not above picking up cigarette butts or robbing a baby of its candy. And of course, if the situation warrants it, he will kick a lady in the rear, but only in extreme anger," end quote. Or, anyway, that is how Chaplin later remembered his conception of the character. In his early Keystone shorts, his early Keystone shorts did not show the tramp to be nearly as multifaceted as this description. Chaplin would, however, come to change the way people think about getting kicked in the rear. In just a few short years, Chaplin would become the most famous comedian in the history of the world and the first international motion picture superstar. Lacking dialogue, his comedies were just as popular with the waves of immigrants who were landing on American shores and did not speak a word of English as they were with native English speakers. One did not need to understand any particular language to find the Little Tramp funny. The medium of the film comedy was still brand new, and that situation gave Chaplin a certain confidence. Quote, "No one was positive or sure of himself," end quote, he wrote. Quote, "So I included that I knew as much as the other fellow. Thus grew a belief in myself that I was creative and could write my own stories," end quote. Soon, this creativity put him at odds with the Keystone method. Quote, "Anyone or any $3 a day extra can do what you want me to do," end quote. He roared to one director. Quote, "I want to do something with merit, not just be bounced around and fall off streetcars," end quote. As Chaplin became more assured, he began to tailor his performances more and more to the medium. In particular, he performed in such ways that the butchers in the editing room could not change his routines. He was always distressed when the editors cut out his favorite bits, so he started working gags into his entrances and exits that he knew they would never be able to excise without confusing what little story there was. In time, his comedies grew more successful. And as they did so, Chaplin was able to walk Senate into letting him direct his own pictures, though Senate made him put up some of his own money, giving him the chance to experiment with such things as how the placement of a camera could enhance or subtract from the effectiveness of a gag. He began to introduce a certain subtlety into the medium, which had always relied on a very broad pantomime for comedy. The use of subtlety in Chaplin comedies made them a stark contrast to nearly every other movie on the market, unlike the many short-sighted pioneers before him. Chaplin immediately realized that he was onto something big. He likened himself to, quote, A geologist. I was entering a rich unexplored field on the verge of something wonderful. End quote. The 25-year-old Chaplin was, in fact, turning a slapstick medium into a sort of art, and the public loved it. The studio heads were slow to realize it, but it was this kind of vision, not just plain business sense, that they needed to stay on top in the long run. Soon, with a bonus of $25 for each picture he directed, Chaplin was earning $200 per week, a considerable sum at the time. Chaplin lived, quote, in sumptuous style, end quote, with expenses of only $75 per week. Still, the films he made were grossing tens of thousands, if not more, and Chaplin was no fool. He knew that fame was a passing fancy, and that he needed to take advantage of what could be a very narrow window of opportunity. I'll reread that real quick. He knew that fame was a passing fancy, and that he needed to take advantage of what could be a very narrow window of opportunity. When the time came to renew his contract, he told Senate he wanted $1,000 per week. Quote, I don't make that, end quote, Senate exclaimed. Quote, I know, end quote, said Chaplin. Quote, but the public doesn't line up outside the box office when your name appears, end quote. Senate pointed out that it was only the Keystone organization that made the picture successful, and Chaplin knew that he had a point. Ford Sterling's career had floundered since he left. Chaplin, however, stood his ground. Quote, all I need to make a comedy is a park, a policeman, and a pretty girl, end quote. D.W. Griffith would later tweak this formula by saying that all he needed to make a film was, quote, a girl and a gun, end quote. Senate eventually offered Chaplin a 3-year contract at $500 a week the first year, $700 per week the second year, and $1,500 per week the third year, which would average out to around $1,000 a week. Chaplin, fully aware that he might be out of fashion and not be worth $1,500 a week in 2 years' time, offered to sign if the rates were reversed. Senate was dumbfounded. Meanwhile, Essanay was on the lookout for a comedian. The studio already had a few in their employ, such as Ben Turbin and Wallace Beery, but none were true superstars of the comedy genre. They had a romantic idol in Francis X. Bushman, and a cowboy hero in Anderson. Adding a great comedian to their roster would make the studio a more formidable force than ever. One day, Jesse Robbins, who had graduated from cinematographer to producer-director at Essanay, and who would later direct the first Laurel and Hardy film, put in a call to Chaplin at Keystone. He said, quote, I understand that you want a $10,000 bonus before signing a contract and $1,250 per week. Chaplin, who was nearing, so that was, end quote, after $1,250 a week, end quote. Chaplin, who was nearing the end of his contract with Keystone and secretly nervous that no one else would want him, invited Robbins to dinner, where Robbins said that $1,250 per week was certainly doable, but that he did not know if he could arrange the bonus. Chaplin said, quote, that seems to be a hitch with so many of the studios. They're full of big offers, but they don't put up any cash. End quote. In fact, it had never occurred to Chaplin to ask for a cash bonus before he got the call from Robbins. His best other offer was from Universal, which had offered 12 cents per foot of film, but no actual salary. No better offer had actually come in, but Chaplin played the conversation like a poker hand, letting Robbins do all the talking and implying that he was getting many more offers than he was. At the end of the meal, Robbins put in a call to Gilbert Anderson, who was filming a new horse opera in San Francisco, then came back to the table to tell Chaplin that the deal was on, and the bonus had been approved. Chaplin fulfilled his contract with Keystone over the next 2 weeks, then left for Chicago. Essanay now had arguably the greatest cowboy, the greatest romantic idol, and the greatest comedian, all working in its Chicago studio. George Spohr, however, thought that Anderson had lost his mind. He had never even heard of Charlie Chaplin, and he sent a wire to Anderson asking if he had, in fact, gone mad. Most of the comedians Spohr employed were making far less than a tenth of what Chaplin would be making, and their pictures barely broke even. Spohr, naturally, did not always remember the events quite like that. In 1943, he told the Chicago Daily News, quote, "I heard of a new comedian in New York, a little man with a mustache, a cane, tall hat, baggy pants, and big shoes. I wired my brother to find out about him and sign him up. He answered that it must be an extra named Charlie Chaplin that I meant, and $50 a week would be enough to pay him. Then it started one wire after another. From $50, Charlie demanded $100, then $200, then $500, and finally $1,000 a week. Each wire would find my brother more indignant and me hopping mad that he didn't give Chaplin whatever he asked and get his signature on a contract," unquote. This is surely an instance of Spohr trying to clean up his own image and sorry here. This was surely an instance of Spohr's trying to clean up his own image in his twilight years. By all accounts, he was furious over the initial contract. When Spohr was overcame with people congratulating him on the big coup of signing Charlie, however, he began to become more optimistic. As an experiment, while dining at a hotel, he gave a boy a quarter to run through the lobby announcing a call for Mr. Charlie Chaplin, which led crowds of people to stir about excitingly, hoping for a glimpse of the famous comic. This experiment lifted Spohr's spirits, but he took a leave of absence from Chicago to avoid having to cut the check for Chaplin's bonus. For the trip to Chicago from California, Chaplin traveled in considerably more style than he had on his Chicago trips with Carno. Anderson himself accompanied him on a train ride which they shared with a sheriff, a policeman, and a convict on the way to be hanged, who, in exchange for behaving himself, was being treated to a ride in first-class comfort. Chaplin wished him luck. The two arrived in Chicago shortly before Christmas 1914 and were greeted at the station by Molly, Anderson's wife. It was, Molly later remembered, quote, "bitterly cold. I met GM. There was the little fellow with him. He had no luggage, no handling. no handbag, no overcoat, and there was a severe wind. Well, we all rode back to my Chicago apartment. When I could get GM alone, I asked him, "Who is this little chap?" End quote. Though he surely would not have admitted it to Spoor, it seems that Anderson knew little of Chaplin's work and had signed him solely on Robin's recommendation. He did, however, tell his wife that he saw great potential in the young man. Quote, "I find him clever and amusing," end quote, Anderson told her. Quote, "I think he could be a great comedian. He's being wasted in Los Angeles," end quote. The trio proceeded to Anderson's luxurious high-rise apartment on the city's north side at 1027 West Lawrence Avenue, where Chaplin was charmed by the homey atmosphere created by the Christmas tree and the presence of little Maxine, Anderson's baby daughter. Quote, "A Christmas tree, a baby, it's wonderful," end quote, he said. Though Molly was as charmed by him as he was by her home, she was still shocked at his artistic temperament and habits. She later recalled in the 1960s, quote, "He slept late, very late, and when he appeared, it was without a shirt collar. He had curly hair and never ran a comb through it. The maids kept his food waiting," end quote. Gene Morgan of the Chicago Daily News became a friend of Chaplin's and took him shopping in secondhand stores along State Street to find a new little tramp costume. Having cobbled his original one together from bits of clothing borrowed from his Keystone co-stars, Chaplin did not have a tramp costume of his own. Finding oversized shoes proved a challenge. Morgan later noted snidely that Chicago was the, quote, "city of broad shoulders, not the city of big feet," end quote. Chaplin settled in with the Andersons for a week. No work would be done at the studio until the new year. All the while, he waited restlessly for Spoor to arrive with the rest of his bonus. The Andersons' North Side neighborhood was bustling with well-to-do families and movie stars. A long way, if only a short ride on the L, from the seedy Wabash Avenue hotels Chaplin had shared with burlesque dancers only 2 years before. On New Year's Eve, the Andersons took Charlie to a $5 per plate dinner at the College Inn, a stylish nightclub in the basement of the Hotel Sherman at Clark and Randolph Streets, where the modern jazz music was in sharp, one might say Chaplin-esque contrast to the Elizabethan-style decor. Chaplin, a man who himself stood out by sheer contrast, did not exactly dress to the nines. Quote, "I had to find a good shirt for him," unquote, said Molly. Quote, "and cufflinks and a suit. We wanted him to be presentable, but I never thought of a muffler," end quote. Still, when the trio got into the car to be taken downtown, she noticed he was wearing a scarf. Quote, "On closer inspection, I discovered that he was wearing his pajama bottoms around his neck. I suppose that it was an indication of his ability to improvise, but it just wouldn't do at College Inn," end quote. In the crowd that night, there were many well-known stage actors, including Henrietta Crossman, Macklin Arbuckle, and Mabel Taliaferro. The local papers the next day also mentioned that one star was there to represent the film world, comedian John Bunny, who appeared with a red paper clown's hat on his head. Bunny was, at the time, arguably more recognizable than Chaplin, particularly when Chaplin was not in his comedic makeup. And reporters often mentioned that they had no idea what Chaplin looked like off stage, and most assumed that he was middle-aged or older until they met him. Nonetheless, one of the Howard brothers, a vaudeville troupe, recognized Chaplin at once. He grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and made him stand on a chair while he waved to the crowd of revelers to calm down. Howard announced, quote, "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce you to the funniest man in moving pictures, Charlie Chaplin," end quote. A few minutes later, a furious man stormed the table where the Andersons and Chaplin were sitting, now accompanied by Howard. The man growled, quote, "Do you mean to tell me that this boy is the funniest comedian in moving pictures? Do you know that John Bunny is in the audience tonight? And he has always been considered the funniest man in films," end quote. Howard scoffed, quote, "Did John Bunny say that, or did you say that?" End quote. Quote, "We both said that," end quote, said the man. Howard glared, quote, "Well, you go right back to John Bunny and tell him that is the funniest line he ever handed me," end quote. In fact, Bunny had already filmed what was to be his final picture. He died only a few months after his near encounter with Chaplin. On New Year's Day, Anderson returned to California and Chaplin began work at the Essanay studio on West Argyle Street. To his chagrin, Spoor had not still arrived with his check. Chaplin and Chicago were quickly turning out to be a bad fit. On his first day of work, the temperature was recorded as being 1 degree Fahrenheit, while the high barely scraped below the 20s. The wind chill factor made it even colder, something Chaplin would have keenly felt when commuting from Bronco Billy Anderson's apartment near the lake to the Essanay building just a few blocks away. A publicity photo of Chaplin in Chicago, probably taken earlier, is revealing. The suave Francis X. Bushman and the more ruggedly handsome Anderson flank him on either side. Both men tower over the diminutive Chaplin, who is wearing an overcoat still buttoned to the very top button, as well as what looks like a forced smile. And that is it for Chapter 10. So actually that picture that we just described here, let me get that up here for a second. It says publicity photo of Charlie Chaplin flanked by Francis X. Bushman on the left and Bronco Billy Anderson on the right. And this is courtesy of the Chicago History Museum. And so we've already seen this photo in the slideshow as well as the intro. But you know, it's surprising to me that we didn't, as far as going to film college and even in high school studying film, we didn't see pictures of Chaplin without his mustache. It's almost like they were trying to, what would you call it, like gatekeep this lore of Chaplin being mysterious. Like, there's so many pictures out there of him. Like, there's at least half a dozen pictures that are very accessible that show him without his mustache. We have one other picture in this book for this chapter that I've been saving now for the end of the reading segments because I think it's a little easier to do instead of stopping and starting with reading. So the second and last picture here is a still from the short film His New Job in 1915, which was also directed by Charlie Chaplin. So Chaplin knew about the cold weather here in Chicago, and I'm sure there were other days where it was even worse than that. But those were the ones noted. So, next week we will be continuing looking over Chaplin. It'll be the last part for part 3 of this book, Chapter 11, Chaplin in Chicago. His New Job. And then after next week, 2 weeks from now, we'll be starting on part 4 of the book, titled It All Came Crashing Down, with chapter 12 being the decline of the Chicago studios. So, like I said, this isn't going to be an ongoing series, but it will be a complete one. So I'm looking forward to wrapping this up in the next 5 weeks. I have planned out to part 15, but I really appreciate y'all being here, and as always, take care of yourselves, and make sure you go outside and touch the grass. Give yourself a break. Don't take life too seriously. And do something that'll make you laugh. You know, in honor of Charlie Chaplin. Do something today that'll make you laugh. Or watch something. Be a little silly. Alright? So, until the next one, class dismissed.